Hello and welcome back. In the previous lecture we started writing our Reddit app and we got to the point where we can fetch the data in JSON format from reddit.com and we can display the story titles in the page. However, we didn't pay much attention to the user interface. So in this lecture we'll look at the Ionic CSS components and how we can use them to create a nice user interface optimized for mobile applications. So let's start by looking at these components. If we go to the Ionic website and click on Docs and then CSS components, we can see various components like headers, footers, buttons, and so on. I won't go through each one of them, but I do encourage you to look at this page and get familiar with them. You can see that for each component we get not just a description but also some code examples, and we also see a preview on this phone frame on the right, which is very useful to see what each component looks like this. And you can also see that for some components we get different styles. For example, the header bar can be stable, that has a gray background, or positive, that has a blue background, or balanced, that is green, and so on. And you may wonder why they're using these weird names for the styles, like positive and balanced and so on. Why not just call this bar blue and this one bar green, and that would be easier to remember, right? Now the reason is that Ionic allows you to redefine these styles, so you could redefine bar positive to be something other than blue and create your own themes by using CSS and Sass. But we're not going to do that right now, we'll just use the defaults. In fact, we can see what these styles look like in our application. If we change our header bar from stable to positive, for example, we'll get a blue background. If we change it to assertive, we'll get a red bar, and so on. I think I'll use positive for our example. If we go back to all the components, the one we're mostly interested in for this app is the list component, because we have a list of stories that we want to display. And to create a list, we just need a couple of CSS classes. We need to declare the list class on the outer element that contains all the rows, and the item class on the element that represents each row. So let's try and do that in our application. We already have this div that represents each row because we repeat this for every story, so we can assign the item class to this one. And then we need to add another div that wraps all the rows and assign a list class to this. So let's close the div, and if I save this, you can see that we get the items with more space between them and a small divider as well. However, we get everything on the same line that's being truncated, so that's not great. We can improve things by adding a paragraph tag on the domain, for example. So we can see now that the domain is showing on the second line and in a slightly different font. It's also a good idea to make the full row clickable rather than just the title text, and that's because on mobile devices, for example, it's not always easy to tap on a small bit of text. It's better if you have a wider area where you can tap, so that's why you usually make the full item clickable. And we can do that by changing this div to be an anchor tag and then move the href attribute to that element instead. So if we move the attributes there, and then the story title could be an h2 element rather than anchor. And if I save this, you can see that the title is now in a bigger font, and we should be able to click anywhere on this row and go to the article page, which is working fine. Also, we have thumbnails available in the JSON object, so we could use them. Each story object has a thumbnail attribute. So we can use this to show an image. If we say the image source is the story thumbnail and then we save, we can see some images, although the layout is not great. And also we shouldn't actually use source, but we should use ng-source whenever we have an Angular expression in here. Otherwise, the browser, as soon as it loads the page, will try and load this literal string and get, of course, a not found. While with ng-source, Angular will take care of setting the source attribute only when the expression has been evaluated. But to get a better layout, what we can do is add another item class, for example, item thumbnail left, that will display the image as a thumbnail on the left, of course. And we can see that this is looking a lot better. All the images have the same size, and the title is then aligned to the right of the image. And we can also display the image on the right if we want to, and there are other styles, like we can use an avatar rather than a thumbnail, which means we get a smaller image and a rounded style. But I think thumbnail left is actually what works better for this case. So let's reset this. You can also notice that we get some broken images. So let's inspect this element and find out why. We can see that the source is set to self, which of course is not a valid URL. And that's because of the data that we get from Reddit. When a post is not really a story, but it's a discussion on Reddit itself, it will set this to self. Or sometimes we can get default instead of a URL. So the best thing to do would be to add a default image for these cases. But as a quick fix for now, I'll just hide this image if the thumbnail is not a URL. So we can say ngIf, so only display this element if the story thumbnail starts with HTTP. So this ensures that it is a valid URL. And if it's not, then we'll just get a blank space, which is better than a broken image anyway. The final improvement I'd like to make is that currently the title is being truncated. That really depends on the width of this window, but on mobile phones it's likely that this will actually get truncated most of the time because titles tend to be quite long on Reddit. And if we inspect this element, we can see what styles are being applied by Ionic. We can see that it's using white space set to no wrap, which is what's causing the text to be on a single line and then truncated. So if we remove this style, you can see that it will use multiple lines. So that's what we can do. We can define our own style. In fact, we could use one of the predefined styles provided by Ionic, which is item text wrap. And that will work, but in this case, this will apply to everything inside the row, while we want to apply the text wrap only to our H2 field. So let's go and create our own CSS class and call this story title. And then we can define this class in the style.css, which is included in this HTML. So if we open up this style.css, we can define a rule for H2 story title and say that white space should be normal. So if I save this, you can see that it's now working. Also, it would be nice to align this domain, so the last line, to the bottom, because pretty much in most cases we'll get 3 lines of title and the 4th line will be the domain and anything else we may want to display. So rather than having the domain show on a different position depending on how long the title is, it would be nice if this domain would always be at the bottom. And we could do this just by setting the height on the title. So if we say that the height is 3.6, that is essentially 3 lines. So we can see that now the domain is always at the bottom of the row. And I think that's slightly better. So I think that's enough for now. We have created a simple but quite nice user interface using the components provided by Ionic, and we get for free the guarantee that this will look pretty good on mobile. For example, you can see that it takes care of scrolling the list automatically. And in the next lecture, we'll improve things further by adding another attribute, which is how long ago this post was submitted. But to do that, we'll need to use a third-party JavaScript library, so it will be a good example of how to add a third-party library to our project. See you later.